Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with two film directors, both of whom were foreign, both of whom were artistes. That is, their films were not that well commercially received in the United States, but the art community really liked them. And coincidentally, probably the most famous scene in both directors' movies happened to be a notorious sex scene, even though by nature neither one was what we would call a sexual film director. The first is the British director Nicolas Roeg, who died recently at the age of 90. What was notable about his films is his penchant for casting rock stars in his movies. So in his 1970 film Performance, which is on the list of the 50 greatest British films ever made, he cast Mick Jagger as what else? A rock star. And all things being equal, Mick Jagger was actually pretty good at it. In 1976, Roeg made The Man Who Fell to Earth about an extraterrestrial, and his extraterrestrial was David Bowie, whose podcast we did 2 years ago. David Bowie had never acted before, but again, he comes off pretty well in that movie. And in 1980, Roeg made Bad Timing with Art Garfunkel as an American psychiatrist. Art Garfunkel had just come off one of his numerous breaks with Paul Simon, and he went back to acting, which he'd done in the early 70s. He isn't as good in this movie. Some of his early 70s stuff is better, and Bad Timing got mixed reviews at best. Roeg's best film, and also his most controversial, was a 1973 film called Don't Look Now. No rock stars in it. It starred Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland. It's based on a novel by Daphne du Maurier. It has some Hitchcock elements in it, and it's been rated as one of the top 10 greatest British films. But nobody talks about any of that. Don't Look Now is notorious for what was supposedly a real sex scene between Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland. They were supposedly really having sex on film. This got the censors all hot and bothered, huge controversy, one of the two big controversies about sex scenes in mainstream films in the 1970s, the other being in The Last Tango in Paris by Bertolucci, which we'll talk about in a little while. For what it's worth, Donald Sutherland and Nick Roeg always denied it, but that's one of those things we're never going to know for sure. Here's an interview with Nicolas Roeg talking about some of the more artistic aspects of Don't Look Now.
Nick Roeg is one of Britain's most important and inventive directors. His films range from the Antipodean eeriness of Walkabout to the science fiction thrills of The Man Who Fell to Earth, the dark eroticism of Bad Timing, and most recently, the strange magic of Puffball. But whatever story he's telling, Roeg's preoccupations remain the same: the reflected surfaces of reality, the importance of sound and music, and the non-linearity of time itself. All these traits are distilled in the perfect microcosm of Roeg's work, the opening movement of his 1973 classic Don't Look Now. In Don't Look Now, Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland play a couple attempting to come to terms with the tragic death of their daughter Christine after she drowns. Adapted from Daphne du Maurier's novella, the main part of the film plays out in Venice, where the couple are fatally haunted by visions of their daughter.
We have today and yesterday, and suddenly something happens that they hadn't planned on doing tomorrow. Which their life changed completely, filling in the today part, so have a look at them as they were a happy family. Son and daughter and playing. You can't, that's where the filming takes it. It becomes, it's rather like a painter painting God's work, that sunflowers aren't like they are in Van Gogh's thought. I try to let it move itself. Finding reality is much more exciting than trying to invent it. Sound is something to be tremendously explored. We tend to believe in the familiar. We tend to say that's the definite. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's where we run into serious trouble. Time definitely has a linear sense to it. I don't believe it. I believe it's lateral.
Well, we're going to move on to our second foreign-born film director, Bernardo Bertolucci, who died recently at the age of 77. He's an Italian director. He's best known in the United States for 3 movies: 1900, The Last Emperor, and of course, The Last Tango in Paris. Every time I think of that movie, I think of The Odd Couple, where Felix is directing a movie and he doesn't realize it's a porno movie starring Oscar. And there's this little bit of dialogue between Oscar and his co-stars.
I never acted before.
Oh, acting's easy.
It is?
No, I'm just a substitute school teacher. I've done lots of movies. Did you see Last Tango in Tijuana?
You mean Last Tango in Paris?
There's one in Paris, too. Far out.
Playing Luke?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm playing Harry, the friendly next door neighbor.
Don't I know you?
Did you see Last Tango?
In Tijuana?
No, Tampa.
Anyway, the most famous notorious scene in Bertolucci's movies is in Last Tango, starring Marlon Brando and Maria Schneider, and involves a stick of butter. This is a family program, so I won't say any more than that. Here's France 24 television on the death of Bernardo Bertolucci.
Italian film great Bernardo Bertolucci has died. He was known to filmgoers around the world for his Oscar-winning movie, The Last Emperor, or the erotic and controversial drama starring Marlon Brando, Last Tango in Paris. Despite working with A-list American and international stars, Bertolucci always defended his own filmmaking style against what he said was the pressure from the U.S. film industry. Bertolucci was considered one of the giants of Italian and world cinema. He won an honorary Palme d'Or for his life's work at the 2011 Cannes Film Festival.
Yeah, he's a hero to the auteur crowd and the avant-garde. I always thought his movies were overlong and ponderous, but what do I know? Here's Jeffrey Brown for PBS talking about the career of Bernardo Bertolucci.
Altre comparse non le voglio adesso.
Bernardo Bertolucci made films that both followed and defied the conventions of his times, and won the praise from many in the film world.
He pushes us to the edge of experience, and that's what filmmaking's all about.
Pure visual joy that's impossible to describe in words.
Born into an affluent artistic family, Bertolucci started making short films as a teenager in Rome. His early work captured the politically, culturally, and sexually tumultuous spirit of the 1960s and 70s. Films with art house appeal, such as Before the Revolution in 1964, and his breakthrough, The Conformist, in 1970. International fame and controversy came in 1972, with the release of Last Tango in Paris. Its graphic depiction of the sexual relationship between an older man, played by Marlon Brando, and a young French woman, 19-year-old actress Maria Schneider, earned the film an X rating in the United States and an obscenity trial in Italy, where Bertolucci received a 4-month suspended sentence. The film was heralded by some for its frank eroticism, criticized by others for its emphasis on female nudity and tones of emotional abuse. Many years later, Schneider said she'd been traumatized during the filming, especially its most provocative scene of anal rape, saying she herself, quote, felt a little raped both by Marlon and Bertolucci. The director's later admission that aspects of the scene were a surprise to his young actress drew condemnation. Bertolucci's most ambitious film came in 1976. 1900, featuring an international cast, including Robert De Niro, was a massive multi-generational epic, exploring questions of class and family. And his biggest Hollywood acclaim came in 1987 with The Last Emperor.
I have decided that you will be the new lord of 10,000 years.
It won 9 Academy Awards, including Best Film and Director, for a lush biopic about the child who became China's final imperial ruler, ahead of the Maoist revolution. With 2003's The Dreamers, he returned to the revolutionary politics of his early works, with the story of 2 characters who have sealed themselves off from student riots in the streets outside.
It's about the spirit of those times. A hope of changing the world, of changing the relationship between human beings.
And he kept working in his later years, directing his final film, Me and You, released in 2012 from a wheelchair.
I don't know, I still think his movies are overly long and ponderous. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepp. So we're going to close with our feature tonight, A True Genius, Ricky Jay, who died recently at the age of 72. Ricky Jay could basically do anything with a deck of cards, including throwing them 90 miles an hour through a watermelon, but his expertise was in sleight of hand and amazing card tricks. He had a show on Broadway, he was in the movies, he was on television all the time, and besides being a genius with a deck of cards, He also was an expert on con games, magic, and the history of magic, and he had an extensive library and was well read. He was born Richard Jay Potash, nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn. He did a full magic act on television when he was about 7 years old, probably the youngest magician ever to do that, and he left home early to learn his craft and learn it he did well. Besides being an expert, he was also a great performer, had a great stage patter, and just a sense for an audience. Of course, he was an expert at misdirection, which is the key to most card tricks. Here he explains how dealers cheat when they deal cards, and unfortunately, you really have to see him to appreciate what he does. So this isn't the best format to demonstrate his expertise, but you get an idea.
I did tell you that I talk a little about false dealing. You've heard the term bottom dealing. Second dealing, is that something you've heard of? Yeah, you too as well, Larry? You guys have been around the block. Here's the way this works. If I had the ace of spades on top of the deck and we were playing in a game, I'd want to deal that card to Larry unless I didn't, which means that I wouldn't deal him the top card. I'd make it look like I was dealing him the top card, but I would be keeping it on the top. That's why it's called second dealing. It's an odd concept. It looks like the top card is coming off the deck, but in fact it isn't. So this is something that one could do. This requires practice. Now, bottom dealing, some people say, is even a little more difficult. In this case, you place 4 aces on the bottom of the deck. And again, I want you to see that this is not an optical illusion. The aces really are on the bottom. What I'm going to be doing here, this works with 5 or 6 hands in the game, but in this case, I'm going to deal my opponents a card and myself a card. His cards come off the top. My cards come off the bottom. This is cheating. Now, the most elaborate form of false dealing is something called center dealing. This was literally unheard of 70 years ago. It's almost never been seen. And I'll actually tell you about its origins. In 1933, 2 men who I believe were the greatest card handlers in America, a man named Charlie Miller, who was living in El Paso, Texas, and a man named Di Vernon, a Canadian living then in New York, received a phone call from a mutual friend. And this guy said, there's a fellow out here in Wichita who can deal from the center of the deck. These 2 men hung up the phones, packed their bags, and left for Wichita. Well, what made 2 grown men travel so fast and so far? I'll try to explain in layman's terms. If I were going to deal 4 aces from the bottom of the deck in any normal game, gin or canasta or poker, I would ask the person on my right, in this case Jeff, to cut the cards. So if the aces were on the bottom, you would be cutting them into the middle. So before I could deal them from the bottom, I would somehow have to nullify your cut. Now, this is possible. I could do the hop, the pass, the shift, saute, la coupe. But these are difficult maneuvers. And they're especially difficult because everyone's staring at your hands at that important part of the game. If instead I could leave the 4 aces anywhere in the deck and deal them by feel, this would be an enormous advantage. And that's why Charlie Miller and Vernon went to Wichita. And they knew the name of the man they were looking for was Alan Kennedy, but they didn't know where he lived. So they went to gambling joints, pool halls, bowling alleys. They wound up having a very frustrating week, and they were actually unable to find him. They were packing their cars to go home when Vernon noticed a little girl eating an ice cream cone with obvious pleasure. And she tripped and it fell to the ground. And being a gallant soul, he gave her a nickel and she came back with another cone, smiling. And he said, little girl, do you know a man named Alan Kennedy? And the girl said, sure, mister, he lives up the road a block and a half. And that's how they found Kennedy and saw the center deal. And Vernon loved to tell the story when he was in his 80s. He'd always kind of lean back and say, yes, and the little child shall lead them. So with that thought in mind, a demonstration of the deal. You can see what I'm doing may look odd in one sense because I'm putting the aces in the deck face up. Why am I doing that? Because it's a demonstration. If we were in a real poker game, obviously the aces would be face down, but this is a case where I want you to see me cheating. And what I'm going to do is give a little shuffle and then try to sense where those aces are as I deal them. There shouldn't be any directly near the top or near the bottom. Let's say we're playing 4 hand. We'll make it 5, a little more theatrical. I would be dealing out 5 hands, and I'd be trying to get the ace in my hand. Now, you could see there was no ace on the top. So in that split second, I choose not to take the top card and somehow dig below the deck to where I feel an ace. Let's see if I can do that one more time, and one more. And if I can, that would be false dealing.
As I said, you have to see Ricky Jay to believe him, and even then you won't believe him. Well, as a final tribute to Ricky Jay, I'm going to play my favorite song about magic. It's by the Vogues. I don't like the Vogues generally, but this is a great song, far better than 5 O'Clock World. It's from 1966, written by Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil. It barely cracked the top 40, but it's a forgotten gem, Magic Town.
This magic town was the good life they said could be found. Was the magic to make all my big dreams come true. gotta find it, girl, before I send for you.